Koe. Kia ora, ngā mihi. Ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. E hui mai nei I te ahi nei. Hei aku ringa o Tātou Tīpuna. So my working hands are our ancestors, as you can see. But what I wanted to really talk about is the importance of intergenerational knowledge transfer. Ngā taonga tuku iho. I'm very fortunate enough to be taught the skills and knowledge of our tupuna through my grandmother, mother, and older sisters that I've watched over the time. Carried over 7 generations, over 170 years. We're now on to our 8th generation, fortunately. Sometimes you're born into something that you're not aware of, as many of you may already know. And just a little background story, the last thing I wanted to do was become a teacher of weaving. So that didn't work out at all. But my name, Kahutoi, and Mere, my second name, comes from both my maternal and paternal great-grandparents. Kahutoi is actually a war cloak named after King Tāwhiao's cloak. When at the time my great-grandmother Kahutoi was born, and it was to protect her from the changing world. The mere comes from my maternal great-grandmother Mere Te Rongo Pāmamao, who has passed on these skills, mātauranga, a whaturaranga. And Mere Te Rongo Pāmamao was one of those, was my tupuna that was almost burnt in the Rangiawhio church when it was set alight. So not only is it about my hands, but the kōrero, the whakapapa kōrero knowledge that is continued on, that is so important. And important that we have to, it's an innate, it is inherent, it's an inherent responsibility to uphold. So whilst we do our best to have a balanced life with the modern age now, we have to uphold this tikanga and this knowledge for the next generations. Next slide, please. So I put here, knowledge is power. Yes, it is. It's very powerful. But whakapapa is even powerful. Now, they go hand in hand. This mātauranga, this knowledge that's been passed down, synchronizes, the synchronicity of that is with the whakapapa kōrero knowledge. It is the whakapapa that strengthens that mātauranga that we are all part of. It's this esoteric mātauranga that we are all responsible for, and it's about our well-being that we've relied on, not in terms of our own knowledge systems, our own ways of knowing and being. Later on, I'll elaborate on the elements of how the whakapapa comes together to make a taonga. The next slide, please. So our mōhiotanga, our ways of knowing, it is about our lived realities. And as a child, as a mokopuna, and you're watching your nannies, your aunties, you actually don't realize that your consciousness is taking in what you're observing. So it is about the watching and the persistent to always watch and hear the kōrero, the whakapapa kōrero knowledge. It's not only about the making that goes on and what you're watching, but it's also about the pūrākau that is told while this work is happening. So there's observable knowledge, watching the refined detail put into preparation of a kako from as a, as an example, but how to comprehend the flow and pattern of work ethic and the order of process. That order of processes is watched by all the time. I didn't realize I was being watched. And as much as I resisted learning, and hence, I wanted to go outside and play with the cousins and the sisters and the brothers and get in them, muck in with what they were doing, even in the marakai. But at the time, what pulled me back was watching what was being creative. So I think what was the innate feeling for me was about the creation in these arts, in this practice. Of course, it's more than art for us. It's about survival. So those applied practices, learning the skills of things like sizing, understanding the measurements through using your body measurements, your eye balance, the natural ability to identify materials in the ngahere, and when you go to harvest, how to harvest, when to harvest, all those seasonal practices, the weather changes, and what to do, and having the right ngako. When you're not feeling well, you just don't even go into the ngahere or go and harvest harakeke, because you're not going to be doing right by the material. So it's valuing the material as much as valuing the process. And it's important to know that. Can I have the next slide, please? So it's that puna, the awakening of that mātauranga. And as it says here, the mātauranga āwhānau, which I was surrounded with all the time, was the notions and states of my warmth, but also coldness. Sometimes I would feel alone because I was the only one observing this. And then I would realize, is this just up to me? No, of course not. It was about passing this on. And so things like watching the tui suckling off the korari was a familiar surrounding for me and my whānau. And sometimes to get this knowledge, we have to, go to Mr. Google, internet readings. But the important thing about the applied practice is that you build upon your own mātauranga, your own knowing. You got to ask yourself, is there a difference between knowing and knowledge? And so you start to seek beyond what you already know. And to me, this is seeking further, the rangahau. And what you already know, that's the mātauranga that you seek for. The next one, please. Māramatanga. So it's great to understand what you're on about once you become familiar with different sites, with the materials that you work with, how to process them. But there's no point unless it can be shared. That's the enlightenment. That's the enlightenment for me to know how to share. And of course, I come from an education background as well. And the difficulty for me was to try and put all our learnings into a framework that didn't quite fit. And so I had to write a program up that was conducive to my ways of knowing and being and learning. But I had to put it in a classroom setting. And then I thought, no, I'm not going to box myself or my tauira. And so our classroom would be out in the ngahere, would be out by the pāharakeke, would be going to collect paru, all those things. because unless they can apply or see what they're doing and feel or hear the sounds of one ngāhere and, you know, collecting the kiri of the rākau and what type to identify, one would never know in a classroom. I wanted to show this maramatanga and this kākahu. This is my first kākahu I made when I was finished. I started about age of 24. Finished it 2 years later. It took me that long. But this kākahu, the name of it is called Taonga Tukehua because it shows the generations of knowledge being passed down through the way that I've laid the featherwork. And because it was my first one, I didn't want to use native bird feathers because I thought it would be momo, waste the bird feathers. Engari, I realised by using the different colour patterns, but just the black and white, it can actually stand out. And my grandmother named this kākahu because I didn't know. She asked me what it was all about. And I said, well, that's you passing on your knowledge to mum and then myself. And it's interacting between all the generations. And so it was named. But for me, in this kākahu, that it was about the imperfection of it became my perfection. And I can only build upon that. But not to share the arts, of course, of our tūpuna is a sacrilege. And I keep on sharing, but I'm also still learning at the same time. But also to understand their beauty. So my career pathway comes from the source of our pāharakeke, from the rhizome, so the roots of the foundation, from Papatūānuku to the pūtake, that's the strength of the stern of the leaf, and then to the rau that holds the fibre that is split to make the food baskets, the kono, the kite, the potai, and the whāreke. And then, of course, to extract the muka for the making of our kākahu, and also for our nettings, for our whare. Next one, please. Next one. There's many patterns that we relate to, and I've chosen this one to show today. It's about the patterns of our endurance. This is called karu o te whenua o wāhirua, as you can see. It's been a favourite of my grandmother's rangi Māori heta. But it's about the wāhi. If we take care of the whenua, so too will the whenua take care of us. And it's about us keeping an eye on our land as much as the land keeps an eye on us. And that's why it's called whenua, karu o te whenua o wāhirua. I use this also to, when I gave at the hearings of our Maniapoto hearings, to talk about our lands that were taken and how we've always kept an eye on our lands and looked after them. And it wasn't until I threw this slide up and I had people like, on the tribunal, I talked about the patterns because there are many, that's what a lot of, we've lost, how to read some of these patterns and what they mean. So they tell a lot, a big story. There's a lot more behind just karu o te whenua. But this is about how we've endured over time. Next one, please. I've used this kotahitanga model as a way of, this is te aho tapu, the first line, sacred line. But this is just a model of how the potentiality of the black, the aho, that's the ones going across, the red and the blue and the white. I just did a quick sketch of this. What's important is that the black one will not survive without the others behind it in the whenua that it twists around. So the whenua, that's the warp cord that goes up and down, that's related to the whenua. And the aho are the chosen ones that shows their potentiality. And when you start supporting each other's potentiality, that's why I call it a kotahitanga model, then you work together and you bind together the patterns of endurance on working together in that model. Next one, please. And once again, I want to talk about, so here's a piupiu and a kete whakairo. The whakapapa is powerful, going back to that. If you look at these pieces, to make a piupiu, you have to have heated kohatu, stones. Paru, tree barks, harakeke, muka, the sun to enrich the colours, the kuta shell to extract the fibres, and the water to rinse it out. So all those things I've named comes from all different elements. We've got te rā, the sun. We've got the shells that come from the moana. We've got the wai from our awa to clean it. We've got the repo, the mud dyes. And we've got the tree barks, and it's all boiled with the kohatu, which is held in a wooden opo. So all these things have to come together to be able to maintain. Next slide, please. Okay. We have extraction of muka, the rau. And here's a image of a couple getting married in their whare tūpuna, wearing a kāka feather cloak, that's my dad's, and a kereru and tagged cloak. To have the honour to do that, to wear at their marina, was a real privilege. But it's also about bringing our tūpuna into their day. The next one, please. The balancing act. Yes, we have to balance our lives nowadays with our jobs, like what I'm doing from here at my work, but also to go to a place where my heart feels strong and willing to continue on. It is a real struggle trying to find that time. Next slide. I want to talk briefly about how I managed to replicate a taonga that was lost in the Otago Museum, and it's made from kia, and it's called a pūkoro. And so I felt it best to go back to the source of where possibly that kia came from. Next slide. This is the pūkoro. Now, the Augustus Hamilton classified it as a rag. And but what he didn't realise is that what's imbued in it is the richness and the technical skill of the kairaranga. But as you can see here, and I've put up, it was used for squeezing out the tutu berries after they've been pulped, and the juice was then mixed with the rimurapa seaweed gel, which was high in protein, and then when it was fermented, it became a carbohydrate. Now, there's the science in just that. The next slide, please. The weave construction shown here, this is a taki toru. What it is, or whakatutu, that stands upright. And you had to get the tension right. So it took me ages to get this, to refine this. In the weave, you'll see in the next slide. If you can move to the next slides, please. The taki toru weave has the interchanges in the muka used. The beauty of this kete pūkoro is that you could squeeze it, you could twist it and squeeze it out, the juice out, and it would come back to its natural form because of the weave. Next slide, please. And you can tell how fine this was with my fingers and the strands. There's about three whenu to one of my fingers, maripi. Oh, yeah, just my fingers. So it took me about 6 or 7 months just to make this pūkoro. And the reason why I did it was to bring back old knowledge to our time, because it's never been done before. And the next slide, please. And there it is. It was kept in the dark. And so when I had my exhibition for my PhD, this was the main piece, was kept in the dark, and then I put a light and that up for everyone to see. And this is one of the reasons why I now work in the museum. Next slide, please. And in terms of how I measure my own work, it's like a kaupapa Māori assessment guide for me. I reflect on what I know, and that's about the thinking and the hineanaro, to reflect what I know and how I understand and how we grow together to obtain this knowledge, and to think through what we have learned and start to create our own stories in this time. And that's aro matawai. And then we move to aro tika. So it's like the tinana, to apply what we say we're going to do, to create or do, to determine our pathway and knowledge systems that captures our own ways of knowing and being. And the aro taumata, and that's to me is the way to a side. It's observed by others, and so that your work will speak for you, not yourself. And it's only then that you, before you start to reach the next level of our potama or our pohiri. And with that, I always look at that circle of the patterns of endurance in which we go through, and the highest consciousness of how we reach different levels, because it's about others observing what you do and letting your work speak for you as opposed to yourself. And that's the reason why I'm here at the Auckland Museum now as a Pouarahi Curator Māori, so that I can be amongst our taonga, our tūpuna, that have left us so much to learn from.